Hello everybody, Galva and Daniela Solís here. We are former EFL students. We have recently completed our thesis dissertation and we wanted to share our work with more people and reach a wider audience, people who might be interested in this topic, so maybe it could be a starting point for future research or conversation about this topic or similar ones in our country. So the topic that we have here is teachers' views on using and teaching gender-neutral inclusive pronouns in Paraguayan EFL classrooms. We decided to work on this as the topic of gender-neutral and inclusive language has become something that is more openly talked about. And we think it is important to consider the perspective of EFL teachers in Paraguay and how their beliefs might play a role in the implementation of inclusive language in the classroom. And this particular study focuses on gender and language in the context of EFL teaching. When it comes to the context of our country, the topic of gender diversity has only started to escape the taboo surrounding it in the past decade. There is a big gap in the literature. There are many things that still need to be further studied, as well as there is a lot of misinformation, and we can even see that in the newspapers or on the TV. So that's why we think it is important to shed light on how teachers feel about this particular topic and if they are aware of the importance of inclusivity and representation in their classrooms. In order to proceed with the presentation, it is important to define some general terms such as gender and sex and the difference between both. According to the World Health Organization, the term gender refers to the characteristics of women, men, girls, and boys that are socially constructed. These include norms, behaviors, and roles associated with being a woman, a man, a girl, or a boy, as well as the relationship between each other. As a social construct, gender can vary from one society to another and can also change over time. This same source states that sex refers to the different biological and physiological characteristics of women, men, or intersex people, such as chromosomes, hormones, and reproductive organs. Now, what is the relationship between gender and language, and what is the role of language in people's life? Well, when speaking about gender having an impact on people's daily lives, undoubtedly the language that you use in everyday life, inside and outside the classroom, is significant as well. Language plays a big role in people's lives, and its effect is even bigger than what we might think it is, especially for people who identify outside of the gender binary. In a number of what we or can be considered as more liberally tolerant English-speaking countries, the daily use of they, them in the singular person, as well as other pronouns, has become somewhat more accepted by people. However, it is still a topic in which there is a wide scope of point of views and opinions. Now, when it comes to context in which English is taught as a foreign language, the use of these pronouns become less frequent and can be seen as taboo. Not only that, but the use of these pronouns can also be closely linked to a social stigma that hinders each individual who chooses to use these pronouns. In the classroom, we have a variety of people who come from different backgrounds and different worlds that we have to deal with. So we can start to see how gender and language might be connected to one another in the context of teaching as well. Now, when it comes to English as a foreign language context, how can we introduce gender-neutral and inclusive language in the classroom? First, it is significant to note that although there are pronouns which are considered as new, the particular case of using they, them in the singular person is not really recent. However, in EFL context, this concept might be seen as newer, especially because outside of the classroom, students are mostly exposed to and use their mother tongue to communicate instead of using English to do so. Regarding the use of they, them, and other pronouns in academic settings, the American Psychological Association considers that when referring to individuals whose identified pronouns are not known, or when the gender of a generic or hypothetical person is relevant within the context, we have to use the singular they to avoid making assumptions about an individual's gender. So, taking into account that language influences individuals even after they leave the educational setting, it is important to mention how to tackle it inside the classroom, which is when they are taught the basics of communication. There are many aspects that are behind teachers' points of view and pedagogies that come from their educational and professional experiences, such as the language and education they receive, the existing teacher education program, and the classroom experience that they have. So the knowledge of their second language grammar could only become pedagogically significant when combined with other kinds of teacher knowledge. For example, the knowledge they have of learners, as well as their L2 learning and self, and this might include the knowledge that a particular student might identify outside the gender binary or that they might be questioning their gender identity or expression. Therefore, several aspects need to be taken into account when it comes to teaching gender-neutral and inclusive language in EFL context. What is more, the broader aspect of the educational field, such as the different schools and language institutions policies, as well as parental response, play an important role in the implementation of gender-inclusive language within the curricula. So it is imperative that these particular aspects are handled carefully and prudently. As we talk about this topic, it is important to mention the issues of language and gender in second and foreign language education. We have first stereotypes and gender biases that might hinder the way in which a person expresses themselves, and we also need to take into account students' feelings because some stereotypes and biases in language might make a space seem hostile to them. Moreover, we have to take into consideration teachers' views and perceptions and the belief that they might have on certain topics. For example, foreign language teaching is lacking in some aspects when it comes to exploring diverse backgrounds and learning experiences of students due to the fact of not being addressed more in class. One reason for this might be the teachers' belief that we have said previously, making them not address certain topics as they are not comfortable with them. Or, on the other hand, it might also be due to the fact that a large number of teachers don't know and might not want to further their knowledge either beyond of what the gender binary encompasses. So the implementation of gender-neutral language inside EFL classrooms can be summarized into two aspects. One of them is the predisposition of teachers and students when it comes to teaching and learning respectively about gender-inclusive language. For example, there are studies that showcase that teachers are open to the adoption of gender-inclusive language because it promotes gender equality and gender sensitivity among students, as well as it creates an environment in which students show empathy with each other. We also need to take into account that there are only a limited amount of EFL published materials containing a chapter on how to use these different pronouns in the classroom. However, this is not to say that teachers are not already starting to implement them across the world. The teachers in their own classroom have a certain amount of freedom to adopt the published material they use in the class and to teach the language they think it is appropriate or important without waiting for justification from the higher ups. Therefore, teachers are essential when it comes to promoting inclusivity and acknowledging as well as supporting all students to create a safe environment for them and to make students understand that not only they are growing as language learners, but also they are growing as individuals.
So after discussing all the theoretical background of the study, we'll be moving on to the results of both the survey and the interviews. This descriptive study with mixed methods was carried out on 60 EFL teachers aged 19 through 71, working in schools and language institutes of Asunción. It's worth mentioning that there was a difficulty meeting the amount of participants due to the taboo surrounding this topic. Most teachers who participated have had over 10 years of teaching experience and that identified as either religious or spiritual. Although most participants identified as cisgender, about 10% identified outside the gender binary. Lastly, it's important to mention that most teachers support the freedom of speech, climate change awareness, feminism, and LGBTQ plus movements. When asked if the EPICIN or GIP should be taught in EFL classrooms, over half of the sample gave a positive response. In addition, they, for the most part, agreed that middle school is the ideal time to introduce them. Although there was a lot of variability in answers on whether it would hinder or aid the learning process, a considerable amount of EFL teachers said that it's unrelated, thus the introduction wouldn't hinder or aid the process. In the survey, participants were also asked about their perceived challenges when tackling this topic. The three most mentioned topics were parental opposition, the notion that the Paraguayan society isn't compatible with the topic, and the different views from either the teachers themselves or their parents might interfere with GIP implementation. Now, moving on to the semi-structured interview results, this interview was carried out with 10 participants aged 21 through 56, out of which most had taught for 1 to 5 years. Most interviewed participants had a general understanding of GIP, and those who didn't showed openness to learn more about them. It is important to mention that 50% of EFL teachers stated that the importance of GIP implementation lies in its role to establish rapport with students. The main challenges voiced by the teachers both in the interviews and survey were that none of them received any training on the topic and that most of them considered their training to be insufficient. Again, parental opposition and Paraguay society's incompatibility with the topic are named as the key issues, but a new one is also brought up: governmental and institutional policies precluding the discussion of the issue. Lastly, none of the teachers had a specific plan on how to address parental pushback. To conclude this section, we can see here that 40% of teachers thought GIP would have a positive impact. Most of them also stated that GIP implementation has the potential to benefit students long term. However, it must also be mentioned that there's a recurrent theme of rejection from Paraguayan society, the government, and institutions, but that hasn't stopped a minority of EFL teachers from trying to make their classroom more inclusive. When it comes to the discussion, results were analyzed both on a general and individual scope, leading to trends being noticed. The first one is that exposure to GIP had a much greater impact on willingness to tackle it than age and number of years taught. Exposure in this case encompasses awareness on the topic and knowing non-cisgendered people. Most teachers who were willing to tackle the topic in their classroom also supported liberal social movements. This means that the more aware teachers are on the subject, the more likely they were to discuss it if their worldview supports it. So, what were the conclusions of the study? Firstly, age was deemed not to be a significant variable in EFL teachers' views on GIP use. Personal experience and worldviews actually play a much bigger role. In some cases, age and religion have an influence on teachers' willingness to implement GIP if they're taken into account simultaneously. Also, levels of awareness have a big impact on teachers' disposition. The more aware they are, the more likely they are to show openness to GIP implementation. But the opposite is also true. When it comes to teacher training in the context of the study, it wasn't deemed a significant variable because teachers rely more on personal experiences or they consider their training to be insufficient. Moreover, the main additional factors that play a role in teachers' disposition are the negative parental response, Paraguay's incompatibility with this topic, and having to adhere to institutional policies or views that are opposed to the use of GIP. So, what are the implications of the study, you might wonder? Well, the implications of the study can be narrowed down to three. First, teacher training is still insufficient, which urges for more and deeper opportunities for training. Also, prejudice and little knowledge on the topic from parents and the general public is holding back teachers from implementing GIP in their classrooms despite their desire to do so. Lastly, the lack of support from institutions is also preventing teachers from starting to implement more inclusive practices in their own classroom. To conclude, we have some recommendations for further studies. First, it is important to select a bigger sample to decrease the margin of error. Subsequent data filtering is also needed to ensure transferability into the Paraguayan population. Also, we suggest applying solely closed-ended and quantitative questions in the survey that can be followed by qualitative questions in interviews to optimize data analysis. In the following slides, we can see all of the different sources and bibliography we used to carry out this study. Thank you so much for your attention. We hope our findings inspired others to explore new avenues of inquiry and collectively advance our understanding of EFL teachers' views on GIP implementation in the Paraguayan context.